Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Vaidik Gadadhar Shri Vyāsadeva Bhaktivinoda Ki Jai. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. We are spirit. We're not matter. We're spirit. Conscious, living energy. Part and parcel of the Supreme Spiritual Person, Krishna, God. Oh. So, the absolute truth is realized in stages. It's like the fog lifting. When there's a heavy fog, say in the morning, little parts of it clear at a time. Over here you can see, oh, that's a tree, okay, and over here, oh, that's a park bench, and oh, that's some grass. So, oh, and there's a house. And as the sun comes up, the fog lifts. It's not that there's nothing there. What it is there's something there in the absolute world, the world beyond birth and death, the world beyond the fog. So this human form of life is an opportunity to realize the absolute truth. So, by hearing from the great saints and sages of the past, and wherever possible, associating in the present with those that have realization and are developing love for God, who are identifying with spirit rather than identifying with matter, wherever we have that opportunity to associate with persons like that, it's a great blessing, it's a great opportunity, because then we stand the chance, just by association, of reawakening, coming out of the fog, because they're just like sunlight. Because of their level of their realization, they're just like sunlight. And sunlight is what dissipates the fog. So the scriptures are recordings of such persons who are just like sunlight. Their activities, their realizations, their teachings, their life example, their ecstasies, they're recorded in the different scriptures in different ways. So by studying those, hearing, that's another way that we can reawaken our spiritual life. So this is reading from the Srimad Bhagavatam. And this is a scripture where conversation is taking place between an enlightened transcendental personality, Sri Narada Muni, and a very powerful personality in the material world with a lot of responsibility, a lot of duties, King Prachinabarhi. And he's inquiring from Narada, the saint, inquiring from the saint to gain that realization. He's taking advantage of the association of a great saintly person, and he's hearing from him. So Narada gave an example by telling a story. He told an analogy, a story about a fictional king, as a way for Prachinabarhi to look objectively at his own situation by hearing a story about this fictional character. But he didn't understand everything in as much depth as he would have liked to. So he's now inquiring from Narada, please go a little deeper. I need to hear a little more depth of what you're saying. The story itself had a lot of symbolism. So he's asking for it to be clarified. And at this point, Narada is explaining the relationship between the gross covering of the spirit and the subtle covering of the spirit. There are many coverings, many layers of entanglement within the temporary elements. And so he's discussing here about dream states of consciousness for the subtle body. So this is text 67, Canto 4, chapter 29. So Narada says, sometimes in a dream, we see something never experienced or heard of in this life. But all these incidents have been experienced at different times, in different places, and in different conditions. In the previous verse, it was explained that in dreams, we see that which was experienced during the day. But why is it that we sometimes in our dreams see what we have never heard or seen of at any time during this lifetime? Here it is stated that even though such events may not be experienced in this life, they were experienced in previous lives. In the previous verses, Narada was explaining how what we commonly think of as death is not actually as final as it appears to be. Death is when the outer covering, the material outer covering, the gross covering, where the senses come in contact with the material energy through the sense organs, the eyes, the nose, the tear, the gross covering, the flesh, the blood, the bones, made up of the earth, the fire, the air, and the water, like that. When that is no longer functional, it's served its purpose, it's no longer functional, then it is shed. And I mean, maybe you've seen like a snake, they shed their skins and then they grow a new body. Well, that's what this is. It's an outer covering. That what we see and hear and touch and smell like that. That's an outer covering. Within that is a subtle body made of the mind, the intelligence, and the sense of self, or the ego. These are subtle energies. And then within that is the spiritual being. So the subtle body doesn't die when the gross body is shed or cast off. The subtle body then carries the living entity, the spiritual energy, the soul, to another situation, and a suitable outer covering is then taken on to fulfill the desires that are in the mind, because that's the desires and the plans, they stay within the mind, within the subtle body. And so those carry the living entity to another birth, where they get a suitable body so they can act on those desires. As long as one has material desires, that's what goes on. When the living entity fixes the mind on Krishna, develops Krishna consciousness, God consciousness, he has many names, they don't get, that subtle body doesn't have any material desires in it. That mind doesn't have a whole bunch of things it wants to do in the material energy. The mind is fixed on Krishna, wants to serve Krishna, associate with Krishna, like this. So that carries the spirit soul back home, back to Godhead. So here, Narada is explaining that it's easy for us to understand how when we dream, sometimes things that happen during the day or things that have happened to us that we are aware of happening to us, we have a dream. Now, it may be a little distorted in the dream, or things may be combined in a funny sort of way, but we know, oh, that's because I said such and such to so-and-so, and now I'm having this dream. It's really clear to me that they're related. It's something that happened, and now I'm having this dream. But he's saying here, why is it that we dream about things that we know we didn't have before? I think one example was given was flying. You know, sometimes people have these dreams. I know I have. Where you take a few little steps, like you start running, and then you just jump in the air and you're flying like a bird. Now, I know I didn't do that in this lifetime. However, in a previous lifetime, I may have. So there's impressions. They stay in the mind. So sometimes when you're dreaming, they might come out. That's one way that it happens. Now, Prabhupada is explaining. He says that here it is stated that even though such events, they weren't experienced in this life. They were experienced in previous lives. Okay. According to time and circumstance, they combine so that in dreams we see something wonderful that we've never experienced. For instance, we may see an ocean on the peak of a mountain, or we may see that the ocean has dried up. These are simply combinations of different experiences in time and space. Sometimes we may see a golden mountain, and this is due to our having experienced gold and mountains separately. In the dream, under illusion, we combine these separate factors. In this way, we are able to see golden mountains or stars during the day. The conclusion is that these are all mental concoctions, although they have actually been experienced in different circumstances. So we're getting a little insight here how the mind may work. Looks like the mind is taking some liberty to get creative, combining things. Mind. Text 68. The mind of the living entity continues to exist in various gross bodies according to one's desires for sense gratification. The mind records different thoughts. In the mind, these appear together in different combinations. Therefore, these images sometimes appear as things never seen or never heard before. The activities of the living entity in the body of a dog may be experienced in the mind of a different body. Therefore, those activities appear never to have been heard or seen. The mind continues, although the body changes. Even in this lifespan, we can sometimes experience dreams of our childhood. Although such incidents now appear strange, it is to be understood that they are recorded in the mind. Because of this, they become visible in dreams. Transmigration of the soul is caused by the subtle body, which is the storehouse of all kinds of material desires. Unless one is fully absorbed in Krishna consciousness, material desires will come and go. That's the nature of the mind. Thinking, feeling, willing. As long as the mind is not engaged in meditation on the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, the mind will desire so many material enjoyments. Sensual images are recorded in the mind in chronological order, and they become manifest one after another. Therefore, the living entity has to accept one body after another. The mind plans material enjoyment, and the gross body serves as the instrument to realize such desires and plans. The mind is the platform onto which all desires come and go. Narottam Das Thakur sings, Guru Mukha Padma Vakya Chittete Kariya Aikya Arana Kariya Mane Asa. Narottam Das Thakur advises everyone to stick to the principle of carrying out the orders of the spiritual master. One should not desire anything else. If the regulative principles ordered by the spiritual master are followed rigidly, the mind will gradually be trained to desire nothing but the service of Krishna. Such training is the perfection of life. So we know from Rupa Goswami's Upadeshamrita that to follow rules and regulations just for the sake of following rules and regulations, or to not follow rules and regulations and act whimsically, are both advised against. And here we see that to please the spiritual master, follow rules and regulations for the purpose of training the mind to desire nothing but the service of Krishna. That's why sometimes we see that devotees who are situated in Krishna consciousness, whose mind is purified by being fixed on Krishna, they may not follow a lot of strict rules and regulations. Because the purpose and the goal of the rules and regulations is to become Krishna conscious. When one becomes Krishna conscious, they may or they may not strictly follow rules and regulations, because the goal is reached. It's not to be cheaply imitated, because that can go on too. But then that's disregarding rules and regulations and acting whimsically. That's not acceptable for the path of devotional service. However, bhakti or devotional service can be performed on the level of spontaneous service, which means the rules and regulations for spontaneous devotional service are simple. It's not that there aren't any rules and regulations. There are rules and regulations. Always remember Krishna and never forget Krishna. That's one of the rules in the path of spontaneous devotion. And to hear and chant These are the practices. Fix the mind on Krishna, especially by hearing and chanting in the association of devotees who are also cultivating bhakti in the path of spontaneous devotion. Text 69. Krishna consciousness means constantly associating with the Supreme Personality of Godhead in such a mental state that the devotee can observe the cosmic manifestation exactly as the Supreme Personality of Godhead does. Such observation is not always possible, but it becomes manifest exactly like the dark planet known as Rahu, which is observed in the presence of the full moon. It's a very poetic description. So, how does the Supreme Personality of Godhead observe the cosmic manifestation? He's certainly not bewildered by it. And he's also not attracted to it. So the observing that he's doing is without attachment. He's observing the cosmic manifestation as his separated energies. So for the Krishna conscious devotee who's always associating with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, they're also very objective in their observation of the cosmic manifestation. They have no attraction. They may be functioning within it, but they're detached. They don't identify with the material body as the self. In the second part of the verse, such observation is not always possible, but it becomes manifest exactly like the dark planet known as Rahu, which is observed in the presence of the full moon. It's really interesting. For one thing, Rahu is a dark planet, and it can't be observed without the light of the moon, here the full moon. And Rahu becomes visible during the lunar eclipse because it blocks out the light of the moon. So Narada is giving the example here that the cosmic manifestation can be seen in that way, as blocking out the sunlight or moonlight compared to the Lord was like the light, and Rahu comes and blocks the light. So that's another way that's one way to observe. See, purport, Prabhupada says. It has been explained in the previous verse that all desires on the mental platform become visible one after another. He was saying that they're stored chronologically. In other words, as they happen, that's how they're, in other words, they're prioritized according to when they occurred. And he says that desires on the mental platform become visible one after another. Sometimes, however, by the supreme will of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the whole stockpile can be visible all at one time. When a person is fully absorbed in Krishna consciousness, his stockpile of material desires is minimized. Indeed, the desires no longer fructify in the form of gross bodies. Instead, the stockpile of desires becomes visible on the mental platform by the grace of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Whoa, that's big. That's big. Not in Krishna consciousness, what happens is, as these material desires, which are accumulating in the mind, according to the desire of the living being, the spirit soul, as they're presenting themselves one after another, this stockpile of material desires, the living entity gets a gross material body so he can fulfill that desire. And when that has served, then that gross body sheds or dies, and then the next material desire that's stored in the mind, they get a body to accommodate that. And this goes on perpetually. This goes on perpetually because the desires are always coming. And then they're like standing in line, waiting to be fulfilled. But when that spirit soul takes shelter of Krishna and Krishna's pure devotees, then those material desires, they're all visible. By the grace of Krishna, they're all visible at once. And there's no need for them to be fulfilled. They're there, but they're not going to be getting material bodies to fulfill those desires. The cycle of birth and death is stopped. The karma has no jurisdiction anymore. That is so incredible. That's wonderful. In this connection, the darkness occurring before the full moon, the lunar eclipse, can be explained as being another planet known as Rahu. According to Vedic astronomy, the Rahu planet, which is not visible, is accepted. Sometimes the Rahu planet is visible in the presence of full moonlight. It then appears that this Rahu planet exists somewhere near the orbit of the moon. The failure of modern moon excursionists may be due to the Rahu planet. In other words, those who are supposed to be going to the moon may actually be going to this invisible planet, Rahu. Actually, they're not going to the moon, but to the planet Rahu, and after reaching this planet, they come back. Apart from this discussion, the point is that a living entity has immense and unlimited desires for material enjoyment. And he has to transmigrate from one gross body to another until these desires are exhausted. No living entity is free from the cycle of birth and death unless he takes to Krishna consciousness. Therefore, in this verse, it is clearly stated, Sattvaika Nishte, that when one is fully absorbed in Krishna consciousness, in one stroke, he's freed of past and future mental desires. Then, by the grace of the Supreme Lord, everything becomes simultaneously manifest within the mind. In this regard, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur cites the example of Mother Yasoda seeing the whole cosmic manifestation within the mouth of Lord Krishna. By the grace of Lord Krishna, Mother Yasoda saw all the universes and planets within the mouth of Krishna. Similarly, by the grace of the Supreme Personality of Godhead Krishna, a Krishna-conscious person can see all his dormant desires at one time and finish all his future transmigration. This facility is especially given to the devotee to make his path clear for returning home, back to Godhead. Why we see things not experienced in this life is explained herein. That which we see in the future expression of a gross body, that which we see is the future expression of a gross body, or is already stocked in our mental stockpile. Because a Krishna-conscious person does not have to accept a future gross body, his recorded desires are fulfilled in a dream. We therefore sometimes find things in a dream never experienced in our present life. So desires don't just go away. When a desire arises, it has to be fulfilled. That's why they say, be careful what you wish for. Of course, that's a conscious effort, wishing for something. But their desires arise subtly also. Not even particularly aware that we have some desire for this or that or the other thing. But it goes into the mind and it stays there. When you have that desire, so when the person, the spiritual being, fixes the mind on Krishna and starts to desire Krishna, becomes attracted to Krishna, and then the desire becomes to hear about Krishna's pastimes, to hear Krishna's philosophy, to associate with Krishna's devotees, to engage in Krishna's service. To offer everything to Krishna, to make friends with Krishna. You start to desire this, then by the grace of Krishna, those other desires, they don't have to be acted on. But sometimes in a dream, it may be acted on a little bit in the dream. But it's not necessary to have. See, dream is still mental state. It's not necessary to get some sort of a material gross form to fulfill the desire. The desire can be fulfilled right within the dream, right within the mental state. and make the mind the friend. The mind can be a great friend, full of wonderful desires for Krishna consciousness, devotional service, love of Krishna. Or it can be a storehouse of torture. Birth after birth after birth, gross body, to fulfill the desires that are stored in the mind. Nice. Text 70. As long as there exists the subtle material body composed of intelligence, mind, senses, sense objects, and the reactions of the material qualities, the consciousness of false identification and its relative object, the gross body, exists as well. Well, let's read that first again. As long as there exists the subtle material body composed of intelligence, mind, senses, sense objects, and the reactions of the material qualities, consciousness of false identification and its relative objective, the gross body, exists as well. The desires in the subtle body of mind, intelligence, and ego cannot be fulfilled without a gross body composed of the material elements earth, water, air, fire, and ether. When the gross material body is not manifest, the living entity cannot factually act in the modes of material nature. In this verse, it is clearly explained that the subtle activities of the mind and intelligence continue due to the sufferings and enjoyments of the living entity's subtle body. The consciousness of material identification, such as I and mine, still continues because such consciousness has been extant from time immemorial. However, when one transfers to the spiritual world by virtue of understanding Krishna consciousness, the actions and reactions of both gross and subtle bodies no longer bother the spirit soul. The consciousness of material identification, such as I and mine, that's rooted in the subtle body. So even if there isn't a gross body, that's called false ego, I and mine, false identification. As long as that's there in the subtle body, I identify with this mind, this intelligence, and the false ego itself, I and mine. Then that carries one to another gross body. Text 71. When the living entity is in deep sleep, when he faints, when there is some great shock on account of severe loss at the time of death, or when the body temperature is very high, the movement of the life air is arrested. At that time, the living entity loses knowledge of identifying the body with the self. That's identifying with the gross body. Foolish people deny the existence of the soul, but it is a fact that when we sleep, we forget the identity of the material body, and when we awake, we forget the identity of the subtle body. So here, gross body. In other words, when we sleep, the subtle body is active and forgets to identify with the gross body, which is not active, it's shut down. And when we're awake, so-called awake, we identify with the gross body and we forget about the subtle body. In other words, while sleeping, we forget the activities of the gross body. And when active in the gross body, we forget the activities of sleeping. Actually, both states, sleeping and waking, are creations of the illusory energy. The living entity actually has no connection with either the activities of sleep or the activities of the so-called wakened state. When a person is in deep sleep, or when he has fainted, he forgets his gross body. Similarly, under chloroform or some other anesthetic, the living entity forgets his gross body, does not feel pain or pleasure during surgical operation. Similarly, when a man is suddenly shocked by some great loss, he forgets his identification with the gross body. At the time of death, when the temperature of the body rises to 107, the living entity falls into a coma and is unable to identify his gross body. In such cases, the life air that moves within the body is choked up, and the living entity forgets his identification with the gross body. Because of our ignorance of the spiritual body, of which we have no experience, we do not know of the activities of the spiritual body, and in ignorance we jump from one false platform to another. We act sometimes in relation to the gross body and sometimes in relation to the subtle body. If, by Krishna's grace, we act in our spiritual body, we can transcend both the gross and subtle bodies. In other words, we can gradually train ourselves to act in terms of the spiritual body. As stated in the Narada Pancharatra, devotional service means engaging the spiritual body and spiritual senses in the service of the Lord. When we're engaged in such activities, the actions and reactions of the gross and subtle bodies cease. Krishna. By Krishna's grace, we act in our spiritual body. In relationship to Krishna. Text 72. When one is a youth, all the 10 senses in the mind are completely visible. However, in the mother's womb or in the boyhood state, the sense organs in the mind remain covered, just as the full moon is covered by the darkness of the dark moon night. When a living entity is within the womb, his gross body, the 10 sense organs in the mind, are not fully developed. At such a time, the objects of the senses do not disturb him. In a dream, a young man may experience the presence of a young woman because at that time the senses are active. Because of undeveloped senses, a child or a boy will not see a young woman in his dreams. Senses are active in youth, even when one dreams. And although there may be no young woman present, the senses may act and there may be seminal discharge, nocturnal emission. The activities of the subtle and gross bodies depend on how developed conditions are. The example of the moon is very appropriate. On a dark moon night, the full shining moon is still present. But it appears not to be present due to conditions. Similarly, the senses of the living entity are there, but they only become active when the gross body and the subtle body are developed. Unless the senses of the gross body are developed, they will not act on the subtle body. Similarly, because of the absence of desires in the subtle body, there may be no development in the gross body. So it goes both ways. As the gross body develops, the impressions coming from the senses, the desires coming from the senses, feed back into the mind. And also, the desires within the mind dictate to the senses. The desires of the mind then get the gross body to develop. Senses of the little entity are there. They only become active when the gross body and the subtle body are developed. Unless the senses of the gross body are developed, they will not act on the subtle body. And because of absence of desires in the subtle body, there may be no development in the gross body. Text 73. When the living entity dreams, the sense objects are not actually present. However, because one has associated with the sense objects, they become manifest. Similarly, the living entity with undeveloped senses does not cease to exist materially, even though he may not be exactly in contact with the sense objects. When the living entity dreams, the sense objects are not actually present. However, because one is associated with the sense objects, they become manifest in the dream. Memory. And on the other hand, the living entity with undeveloped senses does not cease to exist materially, even though he may not be exactly in contact with the sense objects. So that's like the seed-like form. It's lying there dormant like a little seed-like form. It is sometimes said that because a child is innocent, he's completely pure. Actually, it's not the fact. The effects of fruitive activities reserved in the subtle body appear in 3 concurrent stages. Here we go. One is called the bija, the root. Another is called kutastha, the desire. And another is called palanmukha, about to fructify. The manifest stage is called prarabdha, already in action. In a conscious or unconscious state, the actions of the subtle or gross bodies may not be manifest, but such states cannot be called a liberated state. A child may be innocent, but this does not mean he's a liberated soul. Everything is held in reservation, and everything will become manifest in due course of time. Even in the absence of certain manifestations in the subtle body, the objects of sense enjoyment may act. The example has been given of a nocturnal emission, in which the physical senses act even when the physical objects are not manifest. The three modes of material nature may not be manifest in the subtle body, but the contamination of the three modes remains conserved, and in due course of time it becomes manifest. Even if the reactions of the subtle and gross bodies are not manifest, one does not become free from the material conditions. Therefore, it is wrong to say that a child is as good as a liberated soul. Text 74. The five sense objects, the five sense organs, the five knowledge acquiring senses, and the mind are the 16 material expansions. These combine with the living entity and are influenced by the three modes of material nature. Thus, the existence of the conditioned soul is understood. Mamevamsa jivaloke, jiva buddha sanatana, nanakshastan indriyani, prakriti stani kashati. The living entities in this conditioned world are my eternal, fragmental parts. Due to conditioned life, are struggling very hard with the six senses, which include the mind. Here it is also explained that the living entity comes in contact with the 16 material elements and is influenced by the three modes of material nature. The living entity and this combination of elements combine to form what is called Jiva Bhuta, the conditioned soul that struggles hard within material nature. The total material existence is first agitated by the three modes of material nature, and these become the living conditions of the living entity. Thus, the subtle and gross bodies develop. The ingredients are earth, water, fire, air, sky, and so on. According to Srimadvacharya, when consciousness, the living force in the heart, is agitated by the three modes of material nature, then the subtle body of the living entity, consisting of the mind, the sense objects, the five senses that acquire knowledge, and the five senses for acting in the material condition become possible. So the total aggregate of all the material energy is there, and when the three modes of material nature become active, it's the Lord's energies, modes of material nature agitate, and that's when the manifestations take place, according to the three modes of material nature: goodness, passion, and ignorance. Hare Krishna. Okay, text 75. By virtue of the processes of the subtle body, the living entity develops and gives up gross bodies. This is known as the transmigration of the soul. Thus the soul becomes subjected to different types of so-called enjoyment, lamentation, fear, happiness, and unhappiness. Thus he begins his material existence, which means that he transmigrates from one body to another, and becomes more and more entangled in material existence. The process of Krishna consciousness, by which one always thinks of Krishna, is the transcendental process by which one can revert to his original spiritual existence. Devotional service means always to think of Krishna. Manmana bhavamad bhakto madhyajimam namaskaro mame vasyasi satyam te pratijane priyosime. Always think of me, become my devotee, worship me, and offer your homage unto me. Thus you will come to me without fail. I promise you this, because you're my very dear friend. One should always engage in the Lord's devotional service. Modern psychologists can study the actions of the mind, thinking, feeling, and willing, but they are unable to go deep into the matter. This is due to their lack of knowledge and to their not being associated with a liberated acharya. Evam param para praptam imam rajarshayo vidhu sakalanena mahata yoganashta parantapa. This supreme science was thus received through the chain of disciplic succession, and the saintly kings understood it in that way. But in the course of time, the succession was broken, and therefore the science as it is appears to be lost. So-called psychologists and philosophers in the modern age do not know of the activities of the subtle body, and they cannot understand what is meant by the transmigration of the soul. Dehinosmin yatadehe kamaram yoganam jara tatadehantara praptam dhirastachanamuti. As the embodied soul continually passes in this body from boyhood to youth to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at death. The self-realized soul is not bewildered by such a change. Unless all human society understands this important verse in the Bhagavad Gita, civilization will advance in ignorance, not in knowledge. So that'll be it for this reading. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram,